her door. That is beyond her concrete backyard, under which all manner of creatures were still flourishing. When reading the encyclopedia, she gravitated to the letter T, which she could tell her parents was to look up Taiwan, when in fact she was reading about termites, ticks, and termites. Joyce went on to study architecture, a safe, concrete art that her parents could support. But little did they know how she would be working the way to carve away at this edifice, little bite by bite, using bats, ants, and other pests. Now affectionately known as the Batwoman, Joyce has become a Cape crusader for animal habitats and their integration into our urban environment. Her parents are coming to terms with this, as they are with her sister, who has made a lucrative career of training house pets to do martial arts. So with that, I'd like to welcome Joyce Hwang.
Wow, can you hear me? That was the best introduction I've ever heard. That was fabulous. And the truth is that we're not that far off, actually. Okay, so this is great. Thanks for inviting me to this to give a lecture here. In a way, it feels a bit almost like presenting a slideshow at a family reunion or something. So it's really nice to be here. It's nice to be among friends and students and people I know. Also, the fact that you all know the context of Buffalo is it's great. A lot of the work that I've been doing has sort of evolved from being in Buffalo. So I actually just thought since we're among friends, I'd just start off with a life diagram. And just to kind of say that, in Buffalo, where I started the tenure track position here in 2006, and you can really see, looking at this thing, that that a lot of the kind of work that I've been doing recently that has, that's kind of stemmed from a kind of pollination between research, practice, teaching, etc. That a lot of that has started during the time. So beforehand, there was probably not as much influence between one thing and the other, but really coming to Buffalo has been not just the being at the university, but also the city itself has really shaped the kind of work that I'm doing right now. And today I'm going to be talking about, I'll be giving a sort of a version of the lecture that I gave in New York for the Emerging Voices lecture. But I'm going to, there's a couple of additions especially for you Buffalo people. The point of that lecture, I was asked to basically discuss a position or particular voice I had, and using no more than 3 or 4 projects. So I'm not going to talk about the entire breadth of work. I'm just going to focus really specifically on what I've been working on recently and how that kind of stakes out a particular position. And that's really just going to be this kind of latter part. Also, I wanted to just point out that being in Buffalo has really affected how I work as well. This is a list of my collaborators. I think it's actually still not finished. This hasn't really been updated, but everyone that's more bold, that's in white, is somebody from UB. So it's a student or somebody I've had before, or engineer I've met here, or an alum of the school. So there's been a huge amount of influence just in being here that's really kind of shaped the work. So that I'm really thankful for that. Okay, so in the work that I've been doing, I've been really interested in developing visible spatial ways of confronting ecological challenges. And the position that I'm taking is that these challenges are not limitations, but we should see them as instigators for bringing awareness to these issues and also for creative practice. Recently, I've become preoccupied with what I think of as being conflicted perceptions of urban wildlife, and I especially think about the idea of the urban pest. I would argue that within current discourses of sustainable design, the ecosystemic role of animals is relatively marginalized. So while you might see it mentioned in legal regulations in cities, in architectural discourses, they've often been on the fringe of the conversation. So I'm interested in seeing how architecture can enter this picture and move the consideration of animals beyond the scope of urban regulations and toward some agendas of aesthetics, space, environmental performance, and even ethics. So first, where do we see animals now? Well, it's not new to us that habitat loss is a conditions happening in urban environments. And we've known for quite some time that the processes of urbanization have been rapidly depleting cities of biodiversity. We see today a lot of cities that are attempting to counter these effects and increase biodiversity. So this is actually a place near my home, near all the critters that Lamar was talking about. And this is the Bolsa Chica Reserve. And this is a place that was formerly used for oil drilling, and now it's being, has been over the past years, been transformed into constructed wetlands. And now when you go walk around there, you see lots of species of birds and aquatic life. But despite these ambitions, I think we also see other attitudes that begin to emerge when nature takes over cities in unintended ways. So, for example, this is a buffalo now. This is the kind of thing that I've been used to seeing here year after year. Think about these types of urban areas that lack regular maintenance, such as lawn mowing. And a lot of this, as you know, occurs in post-industrial cities such as Buffalo. Some of you might recognize this. This is the formerly vacant property of Andrew Perkins and Matt Bain, our thesis students from 2012. And you see a lot of this in Buffalo where vacant and neglected properties are overgrown. And in that state, they're often teeming with forms of life. Dilapidated buildings, a lot of which we see here as well in Buffalo, have a lot of nooks and small spaces, and these serve as ideal sites for animal life in cities. So I think it could be argued that these kinds of neglected sites actually produce conditions that are very suitable for developing habitat, but at the same time, these circumstances are not seen as ideal examples of nature, but they're actually considered to be forms of urban life. This conflict of attitude can also be traced to the way that we consider the presence of animals in cities. So on the one hand, we might see birds as a highly desirable creature that we want to have around, right? So we see this kind of thing embedded in the artifacts that we construct for them. But what happens in a situation like this, for example, when birds or wildlife encroach upon more densely populated areas, encroach upon what we think of as ours, right? In the realm of visual regulations, many urban animals are classified as nuisance wildlife. So look, for example, at the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. They have a list that includes a list of nuisance animals. This list also includes a list of animals that you're technically allowed to take. What that means is that you're allowed to pursue, shoot, hunt, or kill at any time in these lists of animals. And in case you were curious, according to this chart, these animals are chipmunks, mice, moles, porcupines, rats, shrews, red squirrels, but not the gray or the black ones, voles, woodchucks, groundhogs, and certain types of birds like European starlings, house sparrows, and pigeons without leg bands. Of course, we see this perception of the nuisance and the artifacts that we construct for these species. So just think, for example, of in the realm of birds, all these kind of bird spikes and wires and things that you see on buildings. And actually, this is quite formative in my experience too. I spent a huge amount of time on specking these bird spikes for a building, ironically. And of course, we see situations like nets and stuff too. So this is at this point all quite ubiquitous. We're very used to seeing these kinds of things that keep animals away from buildings. Recently, I've been very interested in bats in the last few years, and even more so than birds. I think bats face a particularly difficult situation. They're critical to our ecosystem, and we all know this to some extent. They're critical to our ecosystem in that they serve as pollinators and pesticides. Oftentimes you hear about bats eating mosquitoes and stuff, but I think their role in our lives is for the most part underestimated. And now I think it's even worse because they're being blamed for Ebola and things like that. But their role in our lives is pretty much underestimated. And right now they're dying off in great numbers due to a condition called white nose syndrome. This is something where a white fungus develops on the nose of a bat and apparently sort of wakes them up while they're hibernating, and they just fly around, they can't hibernate, and they end up dying. And this is an epidemic that started in the northeastern part of the United States in 2006, and it's something that's quickly spreading westward. But I think this as a condition, as a kind of epidemic, academic is something that's hardly on the public radar. In the media, bats tend to get a bad rap. So consider movies like Dracula, or Vampire Bats, and here's a storyboard from artist Jeff Wall for that movie, Vampire Bats. And so maybe it's partially because of this reputation that one could argue that their presence in cities is intentionally diminished, and we see a lot of things like this. So even when people want to help bats and they're building bat houses, there's this, what happens is the houses are built and they're sort of blending in the background. A lot of times they look like they're sort of, part of the side of a building, but kind of painted the same color, or painted the same color as a tree or something like that. So they tend to blend in the background. And there have been some examples of bat houses that are large, like the one in the 1920s by Charles Campbell, and then there's also examples like in Congress Street Bridge in Austin where there's a kind of spectacle of bats flying out, and the people really, really love seeing that, but for the most part in the kind of, in an average city, I would say their presence is intentionally diminished. Artifacts that we construct for them tend to blend in the background, as I mentioned. There's also these types of bricks that are, so these are bricks made in, this is a German company, Schwegler. These are bat bricks. So this is a kind of product for people who do still want to help bats, and you can still see this, this product blending into the background here. So here's the bat brick, just there, very, very subtle in the wall. So given these attitudes and logics, and these conflicting attitudes, so on the one hand, this kind of fear and disgust toward animals, on the other hand, the fact that they're beneficial, I'm really interested in how we as architects can develop strategies for incorporating these diverse habitats into our built environment, and how we can shift public perception of wildlife away from preconceptions of the pest and toward a new kind of biodiversity. So this is a project, a kind of speculative project that I started working on. And the first strategy in the work as a practice is to visually intensify the presence of animals and other so-called pests by developing habitat conditions that also give the animals a kind of spatial and tactile presence. So in this project, Pest Wall, we're asking, how can a wall not only act as a facade, but also as a membrane that prominently incorporates conditions for bat habitation? Can we rethink, for example, the image and performance of even a vernacular house? Certainly, the idea of developing a large multi-story wall, potentially teeming with bats and other animals, would certainly provoke us to face our conflicted attitudes toward urban wildlife. But despite these ambitions, I think it was really hard to get started with this agenda, and especially in an urban environment. So we began realizing this architectural campaign for wildlife habitat advocacy in a park. And this is a place, this is Griffis Sculpture Park, and this is a place where I think people might have a better idea of, or at least be able to accept animals more readily as part of our environment. So the installation shown here is Bat Tower. This is a project from 2010. This is the first series of small-scale installations that I've been working on to incorporate animal habitat into design. Here's some closer-up views of the project and also looking at the base of it. What we've learned from our research is that there are several bat species in the Northeast, and these tend to inhabit small spaces within covered areas. They can enter houses and attics and things, as you probably most well know. They can enter them through very small openings as thin as half-inch wide. And bat houses and bat roosts tend to incorporate these like very small slotted spaces. So on the exterior of the bat house, the bat tower, we incorporated these protruding fins and grooved surfaces to give bats a place to land and climb. And the interior also is a kind of cave-like space, which is formed by a series of thin crevices that would support bat habitation. So in a way, sort of thinking about the tectonic of what kinds of things are already living in. The intention here was to create a warm and thermal environment, which is more conducive to bat roosting and habitation. Typical bat habitats really need heat to a large degree. They need to absorb heat. A lot of the heat is actually produced by bats huddling together in there. That's one condition, but it's also important, I think, for the structure to absorb some sunlight. So in this case, we were using using dark colored wood on the exterior to help with that a bit better. We designed a wide and heavy base that would not only stabilize the structure, but also function as planters for herbs that would attract the insects that would then attract the bats. Due to the unique form of this, we had over 400 pieces of wood. To keep track of this wood, we had to deploy a labeling system, and in our case, we just decided we were going to deploy Braille as a labeling system. So everybody actually had to learn Braille. Everybody was putting this thing together. This became, in the end, a sort of visible effect in the patterning of the ribs and what the structure looks like from the exterior. This project was actually first developed as a prototype. Initially, we didn't even really have a site to work with, and I'll talk a bit more about that as a process. So the tower initially was conceived of as a series of modules that could be transported and stacked with relative ease, since we didn't really know where the site was going to be. There were a few false starts in some urbanized areas of Buffalo, but finally the organization, as I mentioned, that was willing to help us out was Griffis Sculpture Park. And this, as most of you know, is located outside Buffalo, about an hour away, and it's managed by the Ashford Hollow Foundation. And the site ended up actually posing a huge challenge, though. We had to move all these components up this unpaved, generally muddy hill. But due to the flexibility of the system, it took our installation team only a couple of days to assemble the tower on site. So most of the work was actually done here in the materials and methods shop. Almost all of it, pretty much all of it actually, except for the assembling part. So the overall form and scale of the installation is something that I think stands in contrast to the typical tactics of bat house camouflage. Rather than blending into the background, this is a project that I think asserts itself as a sizable presence in the landscape. And so far, I think it appears like a pristine sculpture, but then when you look at it closer up, you can see the messy evidence of life. You can see spider webs forming. You can see bats emerging at dusk. There's a lot of insects taking over the structure. And just to kind of say that, since everyone always asks, this is I have seen a couple of bats in here myself, and another assistant was walking in the park and also saw a few. One of my collaborators, who's a biologist, also saw one. So you do see some bats starting to occupy this thing in the summer. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So following the Bat Tower project, we initiated several other small projects in an attempt to tackle similar issues. And the project I'm showing here, a model of this project is Habitat Wall. This is a large wall that is planned to be installed on the side of an existing shed building in the Audubon Society Center outside of Buffalo. And this is something that I was working on while I was at the McDowell Colony when I first began developing this project. And you can see here that it's comprised of a series of bays between the structure, between those kind of structural bays. You see, between these structural bays, you see these kind of areas with the slotted spaces that are for bats and some kind of bird habitation areas up in these spaces. So here is a kind of closer up look at one of those bays, kind of a more detailed blown up version, just trying to figure out how this thing would come together, like where there were pin connections everywhere to try to figure out where things would be screwed in so that it's not just to figure out the process of assembly is always part of the project, of course. Currently, this project is sort of under construction in a sort of stop and go way. Some of you have probably seen bits and pieces of it spread around. There were a couple in the shop. There were a couple in Hayes NXB. So this is something that we're working on sort of in our free time, wherever that exists. This is something that has been ongoing for a while, and I've turned this photo on the side just so you can start to get a sense of what it's going to start looking like once so these areas are going to be hung between the wooden frames. One of the tectonic ideas in this project was also to use recycled materials, including some building components. You can see here these window shutters from Buffalo Reuse. And also another thing, due to the fact that we spent so much time and money CNC cutting the last project, this is one where we decided, okay, we're going to do everything with straight cuts. It's only going to be, there's going to be no CNC at all in this project. We're just going to go low tech and see how this thing turns out. So this is another kind of experiment in the making. So through these kinds of small-scale interventions, we're interested in this idea of habitats as artifices and settings where you might not necessarily expect to see such an installation. And so this next project that I'm going to talk about, Bat Cloud, is conceived of as a kind of floating cloud in the trees. So something that you might just kind of stumble upon or encounter when you're taking a walk in the woods. So from afar, we wanted it to look like this kind of floating mass. And up close, you can see that it's comprised of a series of habitation pods. Each of these pods is comprised of a habitation area above. So you can see here, habitation area above. These are the slotted spaces, and then a kind of planting area below. So ideally, the situation here is that the bat guano, if it were inhabited, would drop down and fertilize this kind of planting area down here. So here's some views, just kind of taking a look at the project from above, looking at the planting. We're conceiving of this project hopefully as some kind of self-sustaining system. So, so the bat guano would actually be useful in this case. So similar to the bat tower, this is a project that was also developed as a siteless prototype, but fortunately we were able to have been selected by the UV Humanities Institute to be part of this thing called Fluid Culture, and through this initiative they connected us with Tifft Nature Preserve as a site and as a partner in Buffalo. Tifft, as many of you know, you've probably all been there, is a dump, or formerly was a dump site for the city's garbage in the 1560s. In 1972 it was created as a preserve, and now it's managed by the Buffalo Museum of Science. It's right in the industrial zone of the city, kind of really close to Silo City, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And in this project, we use the trees of on the site as anchors for a series of cables, and then designed the vessels to hang from these in clusters. The fabrication of this project also took place in-house, and this was mostly done in Hazanis through relatively modest means. The construction of this is comprised of 3 pieces of stainless steel mesh folded together, or folded to increase rigidity, and they're bolted together in this kind of layered system. And there's insulation and other things in between those layers. So again, the vessels were all prefabricated off-site. Of course, at the school, they were driven to Tifft, and along with just several ladders, a bunch of hand tools, and some really, really excellent people, a great fabrication team, we were able to put up the project in less than 12 hours. So one of the issues we've been working with in developing this project is addressing heat retention and internal temperature, especially with this kind of, kind of low-tech sort of building stuff in Hazen XP. And we've learned that, and this is important because we've learned that bats really kind of need a relatively stable and warm environment in order to thrive. And this, in fact, is one of the reasons why they occupy your attics and the indoor spaces. We also realized after the Bat Tower project that, speaking with biologists, that was a project that was fine and occupied in the summer, but it wasn't really warm enough in the winter. So in the winter, it really couldn't be kind of a real hibernation roost or a maternity roost for those purposes, because it was really just kind of like plywood piece with like some little gaps in airspace. So we've been working on using a thermal camera, trying to test out some of the insulation properties of the bat pods, and you can see here, in this case, that it kind of works like my jacket. So here's me wearing a jacket, here's the pod, and here's me wearing a jacket. This is Joey Swirlin wearing a sweater. So you can see that, the thing is not as, that it's working better than Joey's sweater. And so for the next iteration of this project, we've done a second iteration of it, which we installed in Rotterdam, Netherlands. This past summer, we were experimenting with different layers of insulation material to test the heat absorption and to think about, like how it can perform with external heat sources as well. We were using a lot of this plastic pool covering as material for heat absorption. So we set up another makeshift experiment, and here you can see from some of these early thermal images that, so here you can see more examples of some of these kind of experiments and kind of these thermal images showing this mock-ups under a heat lamp. material. This is something that we just did recently in Rotterdam. This project was installed in the Kunsthal in Rotterdam as part of the International Architecture Biennial there. This is the team setting up. Here's the thing finally finished. They wouldn't let us use soil and plants, so we had to put hay in there, which they managed to get for us. Here's the installation. You can see the bat cloud that are sort of hovering in the background over there. And a great thing about this project also is that after the installation was over, it was actually adopted by an organization in Rotterdam. It's been installed under this bridge in a public park, and it's actually being monitored by ecologists there. So we're really happy about that. There's not as many pods. It was quite there's only a few pods, but we're really happy that that's been installed, and it's sort of it's taking on a second life outside of just being part of this exhibition. So back to Buffalo, I think this is a project that's provoked a number of reactions. The perceptual effects of this project render it, I think, as an unexpected encounter. And this, I think, is something that's, at least the sense that I get is that it seems to have caught the attention of the local population here and some of the media as well. And so since this project's installation, it's funny, I've actually been getting a lot of emails from a range of people with questions like, how do I remove bats from my house? Or could I sell them some of these pods? Could I make some of these pods for them? And I also got emails from Boy Scout troops saying that they wanted to build bat houses for their Eagle Scout project, and they wanted some advice on that. So it's interesting how, these kind of non-architectural emails come, of course it's architectural, but these emails from the public come in just out of, because they're curious about this thing. And so, I think in the grand scheme of cities and regions, some of these small projects, such as Bat Tower, Habitat Wall, and Bat Cloud are small, but I think they also are able to instigate curiosity at a larger scale. So let's switch a bit to thinking about the larger scale. Let's think about the potential not necessarily as isolated moments, but something that can be deployed within this larger urban system. This is a map that is looking at the location, so down below where you can't really see very well, but this is Tifft Nature Preserve. So this is looking at South Buffalo, and a lot of these are the black areas are vacant sites. And so a lot of the structures around there are abandoned. This is from Silo City, but a lot of these spaces are already being used by habitat. They're already being used by animals for various purposes. And so what if we think, projectively, and we start with this condition today, and we start to think about these vacant spaces not necessarily just as abandoned buildings, but as potentially productive landscapes. So what if we started looking at a condition more like this? So could these spaces become spaces for habitats? Could they become spaces for urban wildlife? Can we have more vegetation in these kinds of spaces? So if the bigger goal is to make a spaces for these types of species to thrive in cities, then we have to think about the small scale interventions, I think, not just as an end product in and of itself, but also, I think really importantly, as a way to instigate the beginning of a series or a trajectory of interventions. So then the question for me is always like, how do you start to produce an aggregation of effects within the larger territory? So I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit and just talk about another project, generative zoning. It might seem really different, but it kind of follows maybe the same line of thinking. So I've been, to think about the kind of larger social and ecological effects, I've been looking at ways to, this is actually another thing that happened since I moved to Buffalo. I've become really interested in the zoning system here, which, as you all know, is undergoing great change right now. But I've been looking at the regulatory structures in the city to think if there's any kind of new ways or ways to possibly mine them. So, as you know, cities undergoing a battle hall. It's called the Buffalo Green Code. It's something that the city of Buffalo is working on. Urban Design Project, Bob's been working on that for quite some time. So there's a lot of effort going into this. I'm not actually going to talk about that at all. I haven't been working on that at all. But I'll just talk about this project which is sort of related to this effort of greening the city. So this is really more about mining the city's existing outdated codes and what you could do in this interim period, perhaps. So this is a redrawn zoning map of Buffalo. So I've drawn it in terms of the zoning districts, so they're kind of shown in the different colors. And you can also see here that the city's filled with parks and conservation areas and recreation areas, and they're all shown in areas, shades of green. But aside from the parkway system, which links many of the parks together, you don't really see an explicit mechanism that enables one to weave habitat development across the entire city. At least I don't think. It doesn't seem, and maybe this might be something that's coming up in the new code, but the old one, but at least in the research that I was doing, just reading this thing, it was hard to see if there was anything that really kind of talked about weaving habitat in the city to deal with issues like habitat fragmentation. So in this research project that we call generative zoning, we started to find opportunities to combat this condition and to really try to promote a more continuous system for habitat and animals in the city. We actually received a grant from the Baldi Center for Law and Social Policy to take on this research project. And so the first step for us at this point was really just to visualize the code, because it just comes as a kind of big list, and it's really hard to visualize it. And so first we started just looking at the kind of standard form-based zoning conditions by mapping things like setbacks and stuff. But then we started looking at the permitted uses, and Buffalo's code includes this very, very long list of permitted uses, which we were analyzing in this diagram. You can see here that the permitted uses are organized like this, like where this is R1, and you can see that R1, so residential 1 is kind of nested within R2, which is nested within R3, so it's a kind of nested system of uses. Here it is a little bit closer up. So you can again see the kind of nested uses, like the R1 happening within R2, within R3. So this is us kind of trying to impose our own logic, our own system of thinking on top of what already exists. So just trying to organize what already exists. And while we were looking at this, we started noticing a bunch of different conditions and marked them in different colors. So a lot of these are different restrictions, and I'm going to get into all of them, but I'll just note that the condition that is marked in green was interesting to us because it called for setbacks of 50 to 100 feet minimum whenever a manufacturing zone abutted a residential zone if a particular program was going on. So we were interested in just trying to figure out what these conditions were, and so we set out to look at them in the city. And while we were driving around, we found situations like this where, a lot of times you don't really, in these types of conditions, like where an R district abuts an M district, manufacturing, industrial, those are all in the dotted green lines. There's a very large setback that's required for certain conditions. So just looking at around the city again now through Google Earth and looking through these maps, we were just interested in what does this look like where R abuts M. So this is just a kind of snap through a bunch of perspective going down one particular street on that dotted green line that I'd drawn on the previous map. So this is again residential on the right, manufacturing, industrial on the left. And so a lot of times in these situations, the spaces just become nothing, right? They're just kind of used for parking or different purposes, but they're not exactly made green in any sort of explicit way. So, and for us, I thought this was very interesting because if you think of a 100-foot setback, that's really like half the distance from a block in Manhattan. Manhattan block is 200 feet long, and so this is asking you to set back something 100 feet or 50 feet. So I think that was quite interesting for us to just notice that. So anyway, so looking back at the city map, we were highlighting all of the boundary conditions between manufacturing and industrial districts. And so we started to think, well, if this is a condition that's already happening, and these are spaces that are not being kind of utilized in a maybe not necessarily in the greatest way possible, could this not start to form a network of green space or some kind of linkage of green infrastructure? And so what if these strands were made continuous? What if we started linking them through vacant properties and other green spaces in the city? What if we started having a kind of green system that links through the city like this? This is, in an attempt to sort of bridge or to kind of address the habitat fragmentation issue, and this is not just here, but in many cities. We also started looking at another condition in the zoning code, and this is one that's marked in blue. And this is a condition that requires that certain types of program require a perimeter wall of at least 6 feet high around the property, or that certain building faces are totally enclosed, or with stationary windows, or without any windows at all. And you see this in programs such as manufacturing plants, storage facilities, pool halls, bowling alleys, small animal hospitals, kennels, and auto repair shops. And so those, in my mind, are, speculatively thinking is, if you're required to have a blank wall or wall without windows, could these not be seen as opportunities to promote wall-based habitat infrastructures? So as a way of tackling what we typically think of as restrictions, could we not see these kinds of things as opportunities to make a new kind of architecture? I mentioned earlier that the implementation of these small-scale projects has piqued interest in the community and larger public. And I think indeed the idea of consciousness raising has been a big part of my agenda, a big part of the work that I do also with students. And this is something that so I've been really interested in how these kinds of projects can, these material interventions can instigate action at many levels. So, forming productive alliances, collaborations, engaging different groups, interdisciplinary groups, and working with certain organizations. So, for example, throughout the process of the work I've been doing, I've formed a loose collaboration with a biologist here at UB, Katarina Dittmar, and she's a faculty member in biological sciences. She began as a kind of consultant for the Bat Tower project, and she advised on a number of different issues like the textures and the spaces of the tower, and also helped select the site. She was really keen on looking for a place that bats might kind of like fly through. And it's really interesting, I think, when you're doing this type of project, you go for a walk with a biologist or ecologist, and I know some of you do this all the time. But when you, as an architect, are going for a walk, you're looking at things like space, light, material, details, form, more space, and they're looking at animal droppings, like what you're seeing here in this picture. And here's another case where we were walking around Silo City, and she was fascinated, or she and her team were fascinated by this decomposing deer. So yeah, really exciting stuff. I think it's fascinating. So from this relationship, we've actually developed several initiatives. First, we've been thinking about ways that architectural products can be part of a kind of ongoing science experiment. She's taken actually one of the bat cloud vessels to her research station in Puerto Rico to monitor activity and also to monitor things like changes in temperature and humidity over time. Obviously this is one of the considerations of habitats. And she's also prompted us to make a lot of these kind of makeshift experiments using the thermal camera that I was showing you earlier. So we don't have the resources that biological sciences does, but we can do makeshift experiments. And we've also talked about ways of thinking more about the urban landscape of Buffalo, and she's been taken on interest also. Now a lot of her work was working mostly in kind of natural reserve areas, but now she's taken a much more keen interest in thinking about urban ecologies, which has been really great and really interesting. In the past couple of years, I've also worked to advocate this agenda of what I call urban wilderness in some of the studios. So I bring these ideas into the teaching environment. This is, last year I taught 2 studios where I asked students to research the role of urban species and consider ways of spatializing their presence. And this is an example of a project by Matt Ryberg. Most of you, or some of you probably know him. So this is something where he was proposing a way of using discarded pallets and old tennis balls to create habitats for mice. And so the idea here was to actually draw mice away from an urban residential zone where they typically aren't welcome, to draw them somewhere else, to make this kind of construction elsewhere to kind of draw the mice there. This is a project by Tim Gargiulo in another studio where he was reconsidering the typology of the skyscraper to accommodate large birds of prey such as falcons. And so as most of you know, there's a lot of times these tall buildings are actually already used as large bird habitats. And in this context, Katarina Dittmar has also been an advisor to my studios. Now in 2012, most of you know that I co-organized a competition in Buffalo here at Silo City for students to propose a new bee habitat to move an existing hive from a building that was slated for renovation. And so together with Chris Romano and Martha Baum, and also prompted with, by Linda Schneekloth and Carrie Trainer and Beth Tauke and Laura Garofalo was involved. There were a lot of people kind of in the prompting phase of this. We developed the Hive City Bee Habitat Competition, and this is something that brought in around, I think there were about 40 people who signed up to interest, but in the end, 25 students actually participated in this competition. Most of you are well aware of this project. After a series of rounds of competition, there were 3 rounds. The winning student project, Elevator B, was designed and built most completely by the student team with some advisement from us, structural engineers, and beekeepers, and a number of other people. So the students involved, the designers and builders of this project were Courtney Creenan, Kyle Mastolinsky, Dan Mead, Scott Seelan, and Lisa Stern. And as you probably already know, the project was sponsored by Rigid Ice Metals, which, if you don't know, is a metal manufacturing company here in Buffalo. It's also the owner of the site of Siler City, and also the School of Architecture and Planning and Department of Architecture also sponsored. So it was a very big group effort in the end. So Siler City, as you all know, this is a shot of Siler City. It's a piece of, it's a formerly industrialized land. There's a lot of grain silos being repurposed as a site now for lots of events and installations. Many of you have been involved in a lot of the work that's going on over there. But I guess I just want to kind of bring this up. So before we actually built this project, I just want to talk a little bit about public perception. What's been interesting here is that about the Hive City Competition is I think it shifted some public perception of the usefulness of constructing habitats in the city. And so before the thing was actually built, there was an article in the Buffalo News about this project, and I was really interested in reading comments, so I'll just read them aloud here. So after they were saying, these students are building a beehive, and there's going to be this beehive in Siler City, or in this state, in this site, the comments in the Buffalo News are, how in any way is a beehive on someone's private property in any way going to help downtown Buffalo or the waterfront? Sounds ridiculous. Why do we need more bees downtown to drive out the last 3 tourists? Or I don't know what to say, the waterfront ideas presented each week get increasingly worse. Next week, we'll read that some other fringe group has decided to plant 14 acres of poison ivy in the waterfront and water recycled wastewater from the city. All paid for a grant from the U.S. Botanical Society and a new 14-member panel appointed by the governor to explore the best possible uses for the waterfront that he will never visit. So I just thought it's really interesting to me and really revealing how, after the project was built, how there was such a shift in the media attention. I mean, of course, the Buffalo News did a great job covering it, but I think the comments are really interesting and revealing. Afterwards, these are just screenshots from a couple of the media outlets that feature this project. So we see here Fast Company on the top and Wired on the bottom. So my aims in instigating action among students, architects, and the public are twofold. So first, we're interested in exploring new models of practice. And in a lot of my work, I think it's been very difficult to find organizations outside of the university or arts grants that are interested enough to sponsor the work right away. And certainly saying, in my case, especially saying that you're going to develop architecture for animals doesn't really lead to anything lucrative right away. And even among parties that are interested in what I'm doing, there such as farming groups and bat conservation people and anti-pesticide organizations, all of whom I've talked to, it's really hard to get funding up front, although they've been helpful in other ways. So in our design process, usually the efforts usually the idea of the project will come before there's any other support or anything else, before any support rolls in. And you can see here that support is typically from, as I mentioned before, educational and arts institutions and grants. And so working in this way, I think, also addresses a bigger discussion about whether or how architecture can move beyond its status as only a service industry and moving it, or adding to the discourse about moving it toward some kind of tool for advocacy or for social practice. So in the process of working this way, I would say that the organization of my practice has been quite dynamic. There always needs to be a kind of nimble and flexible schedule due to the kind of unpredictability of funding. So the number of people involved in every project always changes. So I'm just going to take this moment now just to kind of recognize the kind of number of people that have worked with me on all these projects, many of whom are UB students. Back cloud. So it's always changing. Generative zoning, just one assistant. This is the most recent project in Rotterdam. And the second aim in instigating action among students and the general public is that I'm interested in pressing upon them that the consideration of urban animals should not necessarily only be a niche consideration in the field, since occupation by animals is in many ways already a kind of default condition in cities. It's already happening everywhere. So I'm interested in thinking about how these issues can impact actually directly the core of our curriculum, or not the curriculum, sorry, I'm thinking about school, thinking the core of our discipline. So for example, if you just think about something like the Pantheon, and you think about the notion of ornament, it's very possible that for facade articulation, for example, which we typically think of as proportioning systems and style, will start to take on more responsibilities for maybe even hosting animals. Maybe they'll become more performative ornament and supporting different species. So instead of finding bird deterrent spikes on buildings, maybe on cornices and other facade articulation might become enhanced or enlarged to start welcoming bird perching and nesting. And this is also in Rome. We could also think about adaptive reuse in a different way. Could we not develop a range of strategies to reuse existing buildings and structures in cities to take on a wider variety of implications? As we know, many buildings are already a form of shelter for urban wildlife, so how can we capitalize on what they're already doing? We might even be able to think about the idea of urban maintenance in a different way. How can we reconceptualize the idea of maintenance in cities? When we think of maintenance today, we typically think of lawn mowing, tree trimming, street cleaning, garbage disposal, and further embedded in that, something we don't talk about are chemical processes and fumigation, things like that. But we tend to forget that animals themselves are actually a form of ecosystem services. They're actually a form of maintenance for cities. So bats eating mosquitoes, or spiders eating other insects, or stray cats eating rats. Those are all forms of urban maintenance in cities. So could we not consider the landscape something that's more wild and varied, and an environment that would be much more suitable to habitat? And recognizing animals that serve as a significant form of urban maintenance, we're also advocating for an architecture that embraces the potential that might come out of these relationships. So you might think of spider webs as a nuisance on the one hand, things you don't like, but also consider this moment in 2010 after a massive flood in Pakistan when all these spiders ran up these trees and started weaving these huge tree webs, which I actually think are really stunning, and apparently it also relieved the town from mosquitoes momentarily at that moment. So as architects, I think we need to first recognize the potential of unexpected situations in the ecological world, and also their consequences, and also think about them both spatially and performatively. And while we also, we often hear about the performative value of organisms, but we won't be able to take advantage of new opportunities that arise until we overcome our fear and loathing of them, especially of these so-called pest species. So, for example, scientists at North Carolina State are experimenting with cockroaches, outfitting them to find trapped earthquake victims. And while this is seen as a major step forward in the world of search and rescue operations, it's still being met with squeamish comments such as, I'd rather die under a collapsed building than be approached by a roach. That was a comment that followed an article in the Huffington Post in 2012. So I just thought I just love reading the comments in articles, because it really kind of gives an interesting indication of public opinion. So finally, we'll reach a point when we as architects will need to grapple with ethical dimensions of including and instrumentalizing animals as part of our ecosystem. As animals begin to move into a more visible place into our conception and construction of these environments, we'll need to revisit this question of how are we defining the limits between us and them? What are the limits between our world and the world of the other? And as we begin scripting animals into our plans for our buildings and cities, how will we then consider their value, not in terms only of performance and aesthetics, but also as sentient forms of life? So in the pursuit of cross-species design, we'll ultimately need to grapple with a more ethically difficult question that challenges the way that we fundamentally think about our own values, not only in terms of design, but also in terms of life itself. Thank you. So, can I take questions? was Omar's introduction appropriate? Yeah.
Thinking about the bee, there was a competition, and I was assuming that there would be moving that hive intact somewhere to preserve the bees, but it wasn't clear that actually.
Oh, yeah, the process of that was, and when the students who designed that give the talk about it, they actually go into that in more detail, but how that happened is that the hive in the window, so this hive in the window, originally the plan was to try to move it intact somewhere else, but that just, the beekeeper said that couldn't be possible. So, without cutting the thing apart. So we basically used a shop vac and sucked all the bees out of this window with a vacuum cleaner, and then he cut this thing, the hive apart, and actually distributed and made honey out of it. So it was actually, they had 7 gallons of honey at the end. And then they spit the bees back into the new habitat with the shop vac, reversing the flow. And fortunately, it worked at that moment because the queen was captured. The key thing is to capture the queen of the colony. So if the queen is captured and spit back in, then everybody just hovers around the queen and they rebuild the hive. So they were actually able to, the bees actually built a new hive in the project. Yeah. But the students have a big document. They actually made a movie out of it and everything. Yeah.
Go back to the map that you did of reclaiming the interstitial spaces of buffalo. It's a pretty amazing diagram. Have you thought about what other layered programs could happen in these spaces? I mean, if you're putting this animal habitat, is it truly like an urban wild, or what other kinds of layered programs could spawn within the city?
No, I think that's a good question. I don't know. I haven't thought about programs per se because I think a lot of these the setbacks are on people's property. So it's not like it's an industrial company or whatever building. So it's part of their property. So in a way, it's like it can't really say that it's going to be public access. But I think just understanding that there is this network of space that's not really maintained in general is interesting if people are aware of it, maybe there would be a way for people to start saying, okay, well, what can go here? How can this become a community space? If I can't build on this anyway, what could this be? So, but I don't know. At one point I was trying to put up a website so that people would just respond and say things, but that's another one of those things that's, also on the back burner. Yeah.
Well, since Shannon brings it up, I had related question
you're this close to billboards and things like that. So I think it's a really, really great experience that is, in a way that, it brings the public closer to these issues, to kind of understanding, a kind of like, an urban park as a kind of, as a desirable thing. With all there's a lot of like wildflower plantings and things like that. So to see all of that as desirable, I think is really good. The thing that I think the thing that maybe that starts to, I don't know, and there's almost like no way to deal with this in New York, because New York is so populated and so occupied everywhere with lots of lights, but as there's more and more occupation, then one has to start to think, okay, well, how does one really think about where certain species might live versus not? Like, how does one make something where where the animals themselves can be observed but not disturbed, or where you don't have people like kind of sitting for coffee under like backdrop games, or so I think there's other kind of tensions and stuff that one would actually have to grapple with, but I like it. I don't know, do you? Or
Yes, I do. Especially the elevation. That's given a free view.
Yeah.
New York City.
Oh, the one that you're looking on the street, where you're looking straight on the street.
Well, not only that, you have a distance view.
Yeah.
To to Hudson, to New Jersey,
Right.
all that, just great.
Yeah.
So I think that's it's great. But my observation is that they could probably, or maybe time will tell. Maybe portion of that will be dedicated to more conservation for wildlife. You never know. So this is still brand new.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
The
doesn't very just completed, so it's just
Yeah.
brand new.
So the thing I'm really curious about is how, if there is more habitat application and if there's the presence of things like bats around, how that's going to affect real estate value. Because now real estate value is going up over there, exponentially. So I'm just curious, like, does that desire supersede, the fear of bats, or is that not a non-issue at some point? I don't know.
Yeah, so I was thinking about it when you were talking, answering Hero's question, and my thoughts are, it comes always back to the question of money. It's the main driver of everything people do. When they're investing, they want to know if they're going to get their investment back. I was thinking back to one of the comments that the person left on one of the websites, and they're talking about how is this going to help the economy, or how is this going to help the tourism downtown? And my first thought immediately was that Costa Rica is a country that's built almost completely on ecotourism.
Right.
You have other things, but a huge part of their economy is built on these attractions of natural wonders and the different layered ecologies and things. And I'm wondering if there is a way, like you just brought up, the real estate value are going up. And is there a way to integrate your work into the regenesis of the city, or is there a way that you can sell this idea to the developers that are going to be buying the old nurture building, monetize that? There you go. I was thinking specifically about how Costa Rica has been able to, they've been able to both protect their assets, but still attract people and use it as tourism, and they make money out of that. So is there a way to not monetize, not monetize that, but is there a way to integrate two processes of the economy and ecology?
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas for that?
No, definitely. I think that's something that I'm definitely trying to do by increasing the desire component of it. I think if it's just, and I think it's also depends on like where you are. So in like Germany, for example, like Griffis Sculpture Park, in Europe, there's a lot of building products that do incorporate, spaces for animals, and I think there's species are just, they're not seen as like necessarily as kind of pest-ish as they are in some places in the U.S. Perhaps I don't really know, but I just I think like how you, I don't know. I mean, there must be some way to do it. I think right now it's very difficult though. It's quite difficult. Like almost pretty much every time I don't really talk to developers that often. I used to a long time ago when I was working in offices, but if I'm talking to anybody about what I'm doing, and before they actually see the work, before they see pictures of anything, and I say I'm interested in species and animal habitats in cities, the response is always like, oh. That's basically always the response. oh, that's cool, or, yeah, so that looks nice. So I think that for me, I think the whole agenda of aesthetics is really important in this, yeah. Yeah, like how public sees stuff. Yeah.
How do you, if you were to, if you were to kind of generalize your argument a little bit to the sort of the relationship between the city and ecology, I was wondering how you would sort of go about actually, how should I say it, like, these are already very interesting works, and I think sort of the installations are very provocative. But if that was sort of generalized, I was wondering if you ever thought of the sort of opening of, I was discussing this with the landscape architect, and she was talking about how difficult it is in fact to sort of maintain and plant sort of trees and sidewalks, and how much effort goes into sort of keeping those things alive, and how much maintenance they require. And then we were talking about the sort of civic paradigm of building landscape in the city is actually not really conducive necessarily to even the plants themselves. So we sort of kind of shoot sort of, how should I say that, sort of, constraining their development, and in the process we're sort of making it more difficult to maintain, etc. I was wondering if there's something about the work that kind of provides openings to actually build an architecture from sort of backwards, and then see how, what are the requirements and necessities for sort of creating these habitats in tune with the city. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that will lead to this kind of civic landscape projects as we know it.
Right. And so what do you mean by like creating architecture backwards? Do you mean like sort of like finding where these things already exist?
No, just like sort of exactly what you're doing actually, sort of starting from sort of formulated from the viewpoint of the plants, or from the viewpoint
Oh, okay.
of the past.
Right. Yeah.
Because it seems like that would actually those ideas would completely radicalize the sort of how these things actually
Yeah.
merge and live together.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, that's an interesting observation. Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of interesting, like they had a design competition for Grand Park in Chicago a few years ago, and like Hungary Insurance scheme was to do a whole productive landscape in the middle of downtown Chicago, like wheat fields or cornfields, and the city rejected it because of the pests or the rodents. So it's interesting, it seems like you're tackling the idea that you could have these productive landscapes in the city, because you're also kind of designing the ecological systems.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, Junior?
Thank you, Joyce. I think we are kind of living in the world that ecology and sustainability is really overused in a way.
Is what?
Overused.
Oh.
Use the term a lot. And then looking at your lecture, listening, it's really like a fundamental level of ecological practice. So I really appreciate it. My question is kind of thinking about the meaning of design in this situation. So at some point, the form your project should follow kind of biology or the habitat of the bats and animals. On the other side, you also have to think about how people see the form. You have a kind of aesthetic of the kind of style. So that how do you get the balance, or how do you decide the moment between the two? So for example, the bat tower is amazing, very, very nice design, very, very attractive, but in a way that at a certain point is a design for bats. At a certain point, how do you decide? Do you care about it? And
I care about
moment between
Yeah, no, I think actually that's a really interesting question, and it's something that I always have, I think that would take like a whole other lecture or something to describe like how one kind of goes back and forth between different kinds of logics or different, and this is actually something that I see freshmen here, so this is something that we're a lot of times talking about. It's like, okay, well, on the one hand, you have to do this, like there's these things. On the other hand, there's also kind of a spatial idea, there's a kind of formal idea that you want to kind of work with and get across that might not necessarily kind of go hand in hand with whatever the kind of use is, right? And so a lot of times that comes from other methods. So that tower, for example, we didn't have a site, and the only thing we knew is that we wanted to have slot and space spaces, and there are certain requirements that we were looking for. But at the same time, we wanted to make something modular because we knew we didn't really know where it was going to go. So then we were just thinking, like, okay, how do we make something modular, at the same time have it appear as if it's uniform? You know, so that was the kind of like a driving thing. It's like, how do you make something appear as if it's twisting? And we were trying to make something that was, you know, there was a bunch of different options. We usually have about like 100 iterations of something. And for that one, it's like, it's twisting this way. We said, okay, well, twist this way. There's, you know, we want to try to make something visible that doesn't necessarily have a directionality to it, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like a bunch of modules all stacked on top of each other. So then there was, so then the kind of triangulation idea came about. So, you know, it's like that almost in some ways becomes a kind of almost like a separate, like very fundamental form finding, space finding exercise. Or now I feel like I'm talking about freshman studio or something. But yeah, how about, yeah, no, I think that, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
You have, like, you showed working projects that are either sited in, like, the urban or rural setting, and, like, my question kind of revolves around the suburbs, as the suburbs continue to expand and are, like, very ecologically distressing, like,
Yeah.
how do you envision this moving, like, into that realm?
That's a really interesting question. I haven't really thought about suburbs, but I think a really amazing thing would be to try to design, you know, some kind of tract home model or something, a tract house, something that would incorporate some way of, you know, of species habitat, some way of accommodating species in a way that isn't offensive to people who want to live in that type of neighborhood. I think something, or how do you kind of, I think a way to do it, maybe even to think about the big box store, and there's some people in that studio, you know, if you have a whole side of a building that isn't being used, and then the other side of that is just a parking lot, what can you do with that? So I think that could be an interesting possible project. Yeah. Okay, maybe that'll be the next project.